She stepped out of her doorway on July 14th, 1518, into a narrow cobbled street in Strasbourg, and she began to dance. No music, no festival, no wedding procession, no reason anyone watching could identify or name. Her husband appeared in the doorway behind her and called for her to stop. She did not stop. She turned and stepped and turned again, her feet striking the stone in a rhythm only she could hear, her arms moving with the loose, involuntary quality of a body that has been taken over by something operating on its own agenda. The sun moved across the sky and she kept moving beneath it. Neighbors gathered and watched and dispersed and came back, and she was still there. When the light finally left the street and the air turned cool and the city settled into its evening routines, Frau Trophäa collapsed in the dust of the cobblestones in a twitching, exhausted heap. She slept for a few hours. In the morning she rose on feet that had swollen overnight, feet whose skin had split and bled and dried into a tight, cracked ruin. And she began again. She danced for 4 days. In some accounts, 6. The historical record preserves this detail with the specificity of a document that was never intended to be read 500 years later. Clinical, bureaucratic, certain. She danced until the authorities, frightened and bewildered, bundled her into a wagon and sent her 30 miles away to a shrine where a saint might be persuaded to intervene. By then, it was already too late for the intervention to be only about Frau Trophäa. 34 people were dancing in the street behind her. This is not folklore. This is not exaggeration. This is documented in city council minutes, physician reports, cathedral sermons, and 6 separate chronicle accounts written in Latin and High German by people who were present in Strasbourg in the summer of 1518. The dancing happened. What started it is a question that 5 centuries of scholarship have circled without landing on an answer that fully holds. To understand what happened in Strasbourg in the summer of 1518, you have to first understand what Strasbourg had been enduring for the decade before it. The city sat on the Rhine in what is now northeastern France, then a prosperous and independent free city within the Holy Roman Empire, a place of guild halls and merchant quarters, and the thick-beamed, half-timbered houses that lined its narrow streets, like walls of dark wood and plaster. Strasbourg in 1518 was a functioning civilization, a city of laws, of records, of physicians trained in ancient Greek medical theory, of priests who traced the logic of God's will through the suffering of their congregations and found in that suffering a comprehensive explanation: sin. The people were suffering because they deserved to suffer. If they prayed harder, fasted more diligently, propitiated the right saints with sufficient fear and devotion, perhaps the suffering would ease. The suffering had not eased. Serious famines had swept through the region in 1492, in 1502, in 1511. Each one hollowed people out, first their savings, then their livestock, then their willingness to believe the next season would be different. A drought in the summer of 1516 burned the crops where they stood. The following year, 1517, was labeled by a Strasbourg resident in a contemporary account with a word that needs no translation: the bad year. Families had taken high-interest loans against futures that would not come. They had slaughtered their breeding animals for meat. They had appeared in the city's streets with their hands out, reduced to begging from neighbors who had almost nothing to give. Peasant uprisings had flared through the region in desperation and been put down with the blunt efficiency of a ruling class that was not prepared to renegotiate the terms of anyone's misery. But this is not simply a story of poverty. Strasbourg in 1518 was also a city in the middle of a civilizational fracture it could not yet name. Martin Luther was that very summer preparing the challenge to the Catholic Church that would be nailed to a Wittenberg door and split European Christianity in two. The institution that had explained the world to these people, that had told them precisely why they suffered, precisely how to be forgiven, precisely which saints to pray to and which sins to confess, was beginning, at its foundations, to crack. The people of Strasbourg did not yet know this in any articulate way. They felt it the way you feel a building settling under your feet before you hear the sound. An unease that the existing frameworks could not quite address. A suspicion, growing in the bones even as the mind refused it. That perhaps the priests who promised relief in exchange for penance were offering a transaction the universe would not honor. Then came the illnesses. The outbreak of syphilis, a disease so new to Europe it had no name yet that everyone agreed on. Only a growing terror arrived in the city. Smallpox moved through in waves, and there was something else. A respiratory illness that had come from England and crossed the Channel and was killing people in hours. Those who caught it experienced delirium, uncontrollable sweating, a fever that climbed past reason, and then, within a day, sometimes within a morning, death. The English sweat, they called it, with the matter-of-fact naming of people who had already categorized too many catastrophes and had run out of better vocabulary. Into this city, in the middle of July 1518, during an extraordinarily hot summer that pressed down on the already exhausted population like a hand on a wound, Frau Trophäa walked into her street and could not stop moving. We know very little about who she was beyond what the records preserve by accident. She was a woman of the city, married, living in one of those half-timbered houses on a narrow street, in a neighborhood where the smell of bread and livestock and the particular mineral damp of the Rhine would have been the permanent texture of the air. She had a husband who stood in the doorway and watched her, and was afraid. She had a body that on the morning of July 14th apparently decided it was done with whatever came before and began its own response to the world. The physician and alchemist Paracelsus, who passed through Strasbourg 8 years later and became fascinated by what had happened there, advanced the theory that her dancing was a deliberate act, that she had chosen to humiliate her husband in public by making herself a spectacle he could not control. Paracelsus was one of the most original medical minds of the 16th century, a man who challenged the ancient authorities of medicine with a relentlessness that made him famous and sometimes got him driven out of cities. He was also, in this instance, almost certainly wrong. His theory requires us to believe that 34 people witnessed Frau Trophäa's public humiliation of her husband and decided separately and individually to do the same thing to their own households, and that this collective act of spousal shaming then spread to 400 people over the following month, including priests and nuns who had no husbands to shame. The theory does not survive contact with the scale of what happened. History is not kind to it. It preserves it only as evidence of how desperately the 16th century mind wanted to find a rational human motive for something that seemed to have none. By the end of the first week, 34 people were dancing in the street behind her. They were not dancing together, in the way of a festival or a celebration. They were dancing alongside each other, separately, each caught in their own private compulsion, moving with the convulsive quality that the chronicles consistently describe. Arms flung wide and pulled back, legs lifted and dropped in jerking rhythms, faces with the vacant, inward stare of people who are not quite present in the place where their bodies are moving. Some wept as they danced. Some called out in garbled prayers. Some reported visions, drowning in torrents of blood, images of apocalyptic violence, a terror so intense at the color red that some accounts describe dancers convulsing harder when anything crimson entered their field of sight. There was one detail that returns across multiple accounts, specific and inexplicable: an intense revulsion toward pointed shoes, the fashionable footwear of the era's wealthier citizens. Some dancers recoiled from them as if from a threat, as if the shape of a wealthy man's shoe, glimpsed through a trance, had become the face of everything that had pressed down on them. They danced through the night. They did not stop to eat. They did not stop to drink. The only pause any of them took was when the body's failure became total, when they collapsed in the street and lay twitching in exhausted half-sleep for a few hours before the compulsion resumed and they climbed back to their ruined feet and continued. Their feet bled. The blood soaked through their shoes and dried and soaked again. They kept dancing. The Strasbourg City Council presented with a problem for which the official handbook of 16th century governance offered no procedure, did what institutions always do when a crisis defies categorization. They called for expert opinion. The physicians arrived. They examined the dancers with the frameworks available to them, which were the frameworks of Galenic medicine, the ancient Greek theory of the four humors, the bodily fluids whose balance or imbalance determined health and illness, and the particular ways that the body could fail. Their diagnosis was confident, as medical diagnoses of that era tended to be even when they were entirely wrong. The dancers were suffering from an excess of hot blood. The treatment was obvious. The way to bring blood to its proper temperature was movement. The dancers needed to dance. They needed to dance themselves free of it. The council, working from this medical advice in good faith, began to build infrastructure around the crisis. Guild halls were opened and cleared of furniture to give the afflicted room to move. A wooden stage was constructed before the horse market in the center of the city, in the broad open space where there would be air and room. Musicians were hired, pipe players, drummers, horn players. Professional dancers were brought in to move alongside the afflicted, to model the correct form of the dancing that would, according to the physicians, eventually exhaust the hot blood out of them. Strong men were employed simply to hold upright those who had been dancing so long that they could no longer support their own weight, but whose legs kept moving regardless. The music rose over Strasbourg. The stage filled. From across the city, people who had not been dancing looked up from their work and heard it. A cobbler left his bench with a shoe half finished and walked toward the sound. A woman carrying bread through an alley set the loaf down in the street without bending to pick it up again, and began to turn in circles. The music and the stage and the physician's endorsement had transformed what had been a frightening aberration into something with official sanction, and that sanction spread the aberration further than any of them had imagined. The number of dancers climbed past 100, past 200. At its peak, the estimates in the historical record ranged from several dozen to 400, the specific figure varying depending on which chronicle you consult and which moment in the outbreak it was recording. These people were from every stratum of Strasbourg society. Hawkers and porters and beggars were among them, but so were merchants, priests, and nuns. The dancing had no apparent preference for the poor or the pious or the guilty or the sane. It moved through the city like weather, and it took who it took. Some of them died. The council minutes are reticent on this point. The contemporary records do not list a death toll with bureaucratic precision. The later chronicles, written in the years after the outbreak by people who had witnessed it, or heard accounts from those who had, speak of as many as 15 dying per day at the peak. Modern historians treat that figure with appropriate skepticism. It is the kind of number that accumulates in the retelling, that grows as the story passes through each generation's sense of what the scale of the horror should have been. What the records make clear, without dispute, is that people died. They died of strokes that the sustained physical exertion brought on in weakened, malnourished bodies. They died of the simple mechanical failure of hearts that had been beating too hard for too many days, in bodies that were not adequately fed or rested. They died, in a handful of accounts, of what the chronicles call the exhaustion of the limbs, a clinical phrase for a body that had simply been consumed by its own movement. They died dancing. When the medicine failed, and it failed visibly, publicly, in front of the entire city, the council abandoned it. By early August, the wooden stage was silenced. A proclamation went out banning public dancing and music across Strasbourg, with a fine of 30 shillings for violations, the ban to stand until the feast of St. Michael at the end of September. The prohibition on music was specific in a way that tells us something about what the authorities had observed. Stringed instruments could still be played quietly at weddings and first masses, inside private homes. But drums and tambourines, percussion, the instruments that set tempo, that pull the body forward into rhythm without asking the mind's permission, were specifically prohibited. Someone in the council had noticed that the beat was the thing that spread it. That some frequencies of sound were moving through the afflicted crowd with the same contagious velocity as the dancing itself. The prostitutes and gamblers of Strasbourg, those whose presence the church held to be a constant moral contamination, were expelled from the city. Sebastian Brandt, the Strasbourg chancellor who had made his reputation writing a satirical work called The Ship of Fools, documented this in the municipal archives with the dry efficiency of a man who had long since stopped being surprised by the intersection of catastrophe and institutional absurdity. A 100-pound candle was purchased for high mass. 3 low masses were ordered. The city was praying, regulating, and expelling simultaneously, which is what cities do when they're afraid. The second diagnosis had arrived. This was not hot blood. This was the wrath of Saint Vitus. Vitus was a 3rd century Christian martyr, a child, a young man from Sicily who had converted to Christianity and been tortured for it by order of the Emperor Diocletian, boiled alive in oil, according to the hagiography, and compelled to dance within the flames. He had survived this. The church had canonized him as one of the 14 holy helpers, a group of saints who were called upon specifically for the ailments that ordinary medicine could not touch. Epilepsy was his domain. Nervous disorders, involuntary movement, the uncontrollable body. And he had 2 faces. He could cure those who suffered from dancing mania, but he could also, in his vengeance against the sinful, inflict it. The people of Strasbourg in 1518 understood this with absolute theological certainty. They had grown up inside this understanding. They had been told by the fiery preachers of their era that their suffering, the famines, the floods, the English sweat, the syphilis, the failed harvests, was the direct consequence of their insufficient piety. God was watching, and God was displeased, and the proof was in the dead children and the empty grain stores. If St. Vitus had cursed them with the dancing, it was because they had failed to propitiate him correctly. The logic was internally consistent, the way the logic of a closed system always is. And it meant that the solution was not medicine. The solution was ritual. The solution was pilgrimage. The solution was submission to the saint's authority through the specific ceremonial language he recognized. The worst afflicted were loaded into wagons, still dancing, still twitching, and carried 30 miles to the shrine of St. Vitus at Saverne. Others made the journey on foot, moving in those 3 days the only way their bodies were currently capable of moving. At the shrine, the priest received them. They placed small wooden crosses in the dancers' hands. They brought out red shoes, red for the color of St. Vitus's ordeal, the color of burning oil and the flames through which he had danced and lived. On the soles and tops of the shoes, they painted crosses of holy oil and sprinkled holy water. They placed the shoes on the feet of the afflicted and led them in circles around a carved wooden image of the saint, while incense thickened the air and Latin incantations filled the shrine's interior with sound that was specifically, deliberately not a drum. The dancers offered pfennigs to the church. They circled the altar. They received the consecrated crosses into their palms and held them as tightly as their shaking hands allowed. And slowly, over days and weeks, the dancing stopped. Word came back to Strasbourg. People sent to Saverne were recovering. More were bundled into wagons and sent. The stream of pilgrims thinned, and then trickled, and then dried. By September of 1518, the streets of Strasbourg were quiet in the way that streets are quiet after something enormous has passed through them. A quiet that still had the shape of the noise inside it, that still remembered what had filled it. The wooden stage was dismantled. The musicians collected their 2 florins and went home. We have had 5 centuries to try to explain what happened in Strasbourg in the summer of 1518, and none of the explanations has yet fully closed the case. The most popular one for a long time was ergot, a fungus that grows on rye grain in wet conditions, producing alkaloids that the body processes into something chemically related to LSD. Contaminated rye bread could produce convulsions, hallucinations, burning in the limbs. It was a plausible theory. It sounded like science. The problem is that it predicts the wrong symptoms for the wrong duration. Ergot poisoning characteristically produces vasoconstriction, the narrowing of blood vessels that, in sustained cases, causes gangrene. The chronicles from Strasbourg describe no gangrene. They describe no mass blackening of the extremities. They describe people who could move, who did move, who could not stop moving, which is not what ergot does to a body. It restricts, it doesn't impel, and it doesn't explain why, if the bread was contaminated, only some people who ate it were affected, or why all of them responded with the same specific behavior. The ergot theory also cannot account for geography. Historian John Waller, who has written the definitive scholarly examination of the 1518 outbreak, noted that every documented European dancing plague between 1374 and 1518 occurred in the same narrow geographic corridor, the western edge of the Holy Roman Empire, along the Rhine and Moselle rivers. These areas shared a cultural and religious tradition, but had different climates and different crops. The only thing they consistently shared was the specific belief system, the theology of Saint Vitus, and his power to inflict and cure involuntary movement. This matters more than it might seem at first. The 1518 outbreak was not the first. In 1374, a mass dancing episode swept through cities along the same river corridor, with documentation substantial enough that historians treat it as historical fact. There were smaller outbreaks in the intervening decades. 7 documented cases in this same region between 1374 and 1518. The dancing plague was not unprecedented in Strasbourg's cultural memory. It had happened before. People knew, or knew of people who knew, that this thing was possible, that the body could be seized by it, that the saint could send it, and the shrine could lift it. The pattern was established. What 1518 added was scale and desperation, and a city so thoroughly broken by cumulative catastrophe that when one woman's body found the only language left available to it, 400 other bodies recognized that language immediately. Recognized it the way you recognize a sound you have heard before, but never had a name for. The way grief recognizes grief. The theory Waller arrived at after years of work with the primary documents is mass psychogenic illness, or what that era would have called, with more theological precision, the visitation of a curse. This is not a dismissive explanation, it is a profound one. The people of Strasbourg in 1518 were living through what Waller describes as conditions extreme even by the rough standards of the early modern period. They had been hungry for years. Their children had died of diseases that arrived with names they barely had time to learn before the next one came. Their priests had told them that their suffering was their own fault, that God's punishment was calibrated to their moral failure, that if they could only be pious enough, the world would relent. And the world had not relented. The famine continued. The sickness continued. Martin Luther was, that very year, hammering his challenge to the entire ecclesiastical structure onto a door in Wittenberg. And the institution that had explained everything to these people for their entire lives was beginning to fracture in ways that no one yet had the language to describe. Into this moment, one woman began to dance. The people of Strasbourg had grown up inside a cosmology that included St. Vitus's curse as a real and established phenomenon. They had heard it preached, had seen it depicted in engravings, had been warned against the specific behaviors, insufficient prayer, insufficient penance, that could invite it. When Frau Trophea danced and could not stop, some of those who watched her understood immediately what they were seeing. And that understanding, in a community pushed to the extreme edge of endurance, was itself contagious. Not as deception, not as theater, as a genuine experience of the body, a body that in conditions of extreme and unrelieved stress can lose its own governance, can enter trance states, can move in ways that the conscious mind is no longer fully directing. The minds of the choreomaniacs, Waller writes, were drawn inward, tossed about on the violent seas of their deepest fears. This is not a metaphor. It is a neurological description of what happens when a human being is pushed past the threshold of what the mind can absorb, when the accumulated weight of years of grief and hunger and fear and theological guilt becomes more than consciousness can hold, and the body takes over with its own answer. The body's answer was to move, to keep moving, to exhaust itself in the only language it had left. There is something about this story that resists the satisfaction of explanation. Mass psychogenic illness is the term that modern scholarship uses, and it is accurate. And it is also insufficient in the way that all clinical terms are insufficient when applied to human suffering at scale. It tells you the mechanism. It does not tell you the weight of what it felt like to stand in Strasbourg in August of 1518 and watch your neighbors dance through blood and toward death, while the physicians built them a stage, and the priests filled wagons with them, and the city tried every framework it possessed and found that none of them worked quickly enough. The dancing plague of 1518 asks us something that the clinical language doesn't answer. It asks, what does a civilization do with suffering it cannot contain? What happens when the weight of accumulated misery becomes more than the body can hold inside? What is the difference between a symptom and a language? And if a community's grief finally expresses itself through mass involuntary movement, if the only available vocabulary for the unspeakable is the body moving whether the mind consents or not, is that madness? Or is it something else? Something that looks like madness from the outside because we do not have a word for the thing bodies do when words have failed? The dancers of Strasbourg were not performing. They were not choosing. They were not malingering or rebelling or worshiping or celebrating. They were people to whom something had happened, something the culture called a curse, something the physicians called hot blood, something modern medicine calls psychogenic illness, and that something ran through them like a current through a wire, and they moved until they could not move anymore. And then in September, the current stopped. Nobody knows exactly why it stopped. The shrine rituals may have provided what the dancing physicians could not, a sanctioned way out, a ritual that said the curse had been honored, the debt had been paid, the saint's anger had been satisfied. A door that was not opened before, the human nervous system, given a coherent container for its terror, sometimes chooses to step back inside itself. Sometimes the ceremony is the medicine, and the medicine is the ceremony, and the distinction is not as clean as either the physicians or the priests would have preferred. Or perhaps the plague simply burned itself out, the way such things do, when the pressure that generated it had found enough release. The dancers went home. The streets went quiet. Strasbourg rebuilt its sense of itself as a city where ordinary things happened in an ordinary sequence. The council minutes from that summer are preserved in the city archives, faded ink on paper, 500 years old. And somewhere in those minutes, in the dry administrative language of officials trying to manage the unmanageable, there is a single line that has survived every century since it was written. For the musicians who played for the dancers, 2 florins. Someone decided that the dying needed accompaniment. Someone signed off on it. Someone paid. The musicians went home when it ended. The dancers went home if they could. The records went into the archive, and Strasbourg did not dance again. But the question that Frau Trofea left in that narrow, cobbled street on a July morning, the question of what a body does when the world has taken everything else from it, when the grief is larger than the architecture of the self can hold, when the only thing left is movement. That question has never fully been answered. It is still moving. That was The Dancing Plague of 1518, written and performed by the author, me, James Cawley. I think about the 2 florins a lot. Somewhere in the Strasbourg archives, in handwriting 500 years old, a single line records that the city paid its musicians to play for the dancers. 2 florins. A bureaucratic transaction in the middle of a horror. Somebody sat at a desk and signed the order. Somebody opened the city's purse. Somebody decided that if the dying could not be saved, they should at least not die, alone, in silence. That detail has never gotten any easier to hold. It is not tender. It is not cruel. It is the gesture of a civilization that has run out of words and is still trying, with the only tools it has left, to make a stage for something that has no stage. My name is James Cawley, and you're listening to Dust and Echoes. If you like stories like this, stories that sit in the quiet country between symptom and language, where the unsayable becomes the body's last vocabulary, where history preserves the questions and not the answers, then you're in the right place. I'm glad we found you. I release a new original story in cinematic audiobook format every single week, right here. Until next time, remember this: some grief and emotions are too large to hold, and it's only human to let it out in a dance. And that is okay. We've been doing it for thousands of years. So take a minute, have a dance, and I promise you, you'll feel better.
Just an echo. Just an echo.